Alleged contradictions in the Pentateuch. Could Moses have written the Pentateuch? City Dan. Many view the mentioning of the city Dan as an anachronism. Let's have a look at the argument. Deuteronomy 34 verse 1 and Genesis 14 verse 14 mention the place Dan. But according to Judges 18:29, the tribe Dan conquered the city Laish and renamed the city to Dan. How could Moses write this because it happened long time after his death? Is it really true that Deuteronomy 34 and Genesis 14 refer to the city Dan? Dan is a very old name. This can be seen from the fact that a river is also called Dan. Flavius Josephus writes in Antiquities of the Jews, near Dan, for that is the name of the other spring of Jordan. Encyclopedia Britannica says about the Jordan River, the Jordan River has three principal sources, all of which rise at the foot of Mount Hermon. The longest of those is the Hasbani. From the east, in Syria, flows the Banias River. Between the two is the Dan River. Is it really true that Deuteronomy 34 and Genesis 14 refer to the city Dan? Let's have a look at the verses. There is the assumption that Deuteronomy 34 verse 1 and Genesis 14 verse 14 refer to the city Dan. Genesis 14 verse 14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Deuteronomy 34 verse 1 says, Now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan. None of these verses refer to the city Dan, it only mentions the name Dan. In Deuteronomy 34 the place Dan is mentioned together with the place Gilead, which is a region, not a city. Also Genesis 14 mentions only that Abraham went as far as Dan. Again, the city is not explicitly mentioned. Following conclusion can be made. In both scriptures only the name Dan is mentioned and not the city. Dan could refer to the river Dan, which was one of the fountain rivers of Jordan. Dan could therefore refer to a region where the river Dan was located. The reference to Dan in the time of Moses does not negate his authorship.